Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Dr. Stefanie Babst, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, who joined us from Foch in Germany. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Let me start by asking you this, Dr. Babst. Was this summit, this NATO summit at The Hague, a success in your view?
Well, according to what allies leaders, as well as the NATO Secretary General said, it was all a splashing success. A short and sweet 2.5 hours meeting. The success rate was probably related to whether Donald Trump felt comfortable and was happy, and recalling his press conference, I had the impression that he left The Hague quite satisfied. But that's just one part of the story. The other is that unfortunately the NATO summit didn't deliver any type of strategic footprint.
Okay, but what it did deliver is a pledge from NATO member states to boost their spending on defence and security. I mean, to a level that President Trump has been saying for almost a decade now, it really needs to be achieving. I mean, that's a success, isn't it?
Well, it depends. I mean, first of all, it's a declaration of intent. It's a non-binding commitment along the lines that we've seen 11 years ago at the NATO Wales summit, when the NATO allies made a very similar pledge, this time to 2%, and they vote to really invest into upgrading and bolstering their defense and deterrence posture. It took them 11 years, and some of those countries hardly made it to the 2% target. Now, as far as the 5% is concerned, as I said, it's a declaration of intent, and many countries will continue to struggle with fiscal issues, with domestic priorities. Countries like Spain, Croatia, Italy, many others, they hardly met the 2% target. So I'm not too convinced that this is really a strategic message that President Putin, our strategic adversary, took serious in a sense that it will prevent him from doing what he has been doing in the past 11 years. And I think that's unfortunately.
Indeed, we heard the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reacting to that announcement, that memo, saying that the extra spending won't really make much of a difference. But I mean, obviously the Russians would have said that whatever. And you know, one of the things that has changed perhaps in the last couple of months is that the Russian economy is starting to look quite weak. And they don't seem to be winning this war, do they?
Well, I think coming back just for a minute to the pledge of 5%, it's more or less self-evident to me that Europeans and Canadians need to invest into their military capabilities, into their manpower, into improving the technological base for military capabilities, to overcome the fragmentation of the European defense market. All this is on the political table of governments for the past years. So I would have very much liked to see these governments just doing this, just implementing what they keep on saying for the past years, and instead use the summit to focus really on the broader, vitally important strategic issues. And the issue really unanswered, untackled, so to speak, is how can we deter Russia? How can we actually make Russia understand that it will never get Ukraine? And so none of this was discussed. All the issues, the strategic issues, were brushed aside at the NATO summit in The Hague. Because the American delegation made very clear at the very beginning that they didn't want to talk about a long-term strategy towards Russia. They didn't want to talk about the next steps in terms of securing Ukraine's future. They didn't want to talk about enlargement. They didn't want to talk about China. Well, I mean, I'm not surprised that the Russian side looked at the summit and said, okay, I mean, here were allies, I mean, who pedaled their own shoulders, saying this was one more time a historic success, but the implementation of their political intent will yet to be delivered.
One commentator described the summit at The Hague as being a, quote, carefully choreographed show of NATO unity. I mean, we can be skeptical about, that unity and we can be skeptical about the substance of what was achieved. But isn't it much better that those member states show unity than show disunity? I mean, doesn't it send out a key message?
Well, that's very much, I guess, what former colleagues of mine in the NATO headquarters would say. It's all about showing off. It's all about leaving the impression or giving the impression that there is a particular sense of unity and political solidarity. But people who watch what's going on in Europe, people who listen to what European leaders say, people who listen to President Trump in the past 100 days, they know perfectly well that there is no such a thing as a full-fledged, strong, robust unity. We have a US president who has cast doubt whether he is really committed to NATO ever since he has moved back into the Oval Office. We have a US president who is not only attacking long-standing allies such as Canada and Denmark, threatening them to invade them or make them their 51st member country. We have not only a President Trump in the White House who has openly saying that he is really not buying into the idea of defending the rules-based order and instead is showing more than sympathies to the Russian president. And then we have European countries, such as Hungary, such as Slovakia, who, ever since Russia attacked Ukraine, keep on saying, this is not, our issue. We want to keep our wonderful relations to Russia. We want to keep our business relations. We have countries such as, Turkey, who continue to playing a very ambivalent role towards Russia. So I can't really see the type of unity, that we keep on talking about. And I think it's, it looks to me as if there is an, effort made to propagandize on this message. And I don't think this is very healthy.
What about the meeting that took place between Presidents Trump and Zelensky on the sidelines? I mean, a 50-minute long meeting, their first meeting since they met at the funeral of the Pope in Rome. Apparently, things went quite well. I mean, doesn't that offer you some hope that perhaps President Trump has come round at least to the NATO, other NATO member states' view of this war in Ukraine, and indeed the Ukrainian president's view of it?
Well, let's look one more time at reality. Reality is that the United States has halted its cyber operations against Russia. The United States has halted, or rather suspended, any type of military aid packages in support of Ukraine. President Trump has repeatedly said that he has more or less sympathies, understand the Russian rationale of attacking Ukraine. President Trump has formally acknowledged the illegal annexation of Russia or by Russia of Crimea. And I can't help but think, he's completely agnostic about the strategic fate of Ukrainians. And I don't expect for a minute that this is going to change in the future, regardless of who he meets and how this meeting eventually comes around. So it is up to us. It is up to the Europeans and all those in the democratic camp who really want to continue work towards making sure that an aggressor such as Russia will not get its way and will not, succeed. And I would have liked to seen at the NATO summit a meeting of the coalition of the willing. Where were they? They keep on making noise for months now about working on a deterrence, a posture, a reinforcement operation in Ukraine in order to really contain Russia in the long run. They were not there. There was no mentioning of that. So I must admit, you probably hear that in my voice. I'm really frustrated to a certain extent and cannot really join the chorus of all those saying it was rose and dandy. It wasn't.
Okay, so you might say to the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, whose language was pretty glowing of the US president, some very interesting choices of words to describe him. But one thing he said, Mr. President, dear Donald, this push for increased alliance defense spending will help you to achieve something that no American president in decades could get done. What you're basically saying is that Mark Rutte is perhaps being unrealistic.
I have spent 23 years of my professional life at NATO. I helped prepare and attended 10 NATO summits. And I worked for 5 NATO Secretary Generals. So I'm extremely well aware that every Secretary General of NATO needs to really strike a positive, constructive tone towards the United States, towards, the American president. But I think there is really space between groveling to the American president and making the points made by other European allies. And I was really embarrassed listening to the Secretary General Mark Rutte praising the leadership of someone in the White House who clearly doesn't really share much of what we, at NATO at least, have tried to come across or get across and cultivate over the years, which is a sense of democratic togetherness and a sense of being treated really as a community of values. And I can't see this at all. And as I said, I was really embarrassed.
Okay, well, I mean, you're saying that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, was groveling there essentially to President Trump. But I mean, given the choice between groveling to President Trump and having his involvement and having, some sense of togetherness, and the alternative being annoying President Trump, getting his back up and having him walk away or storm off even, and perhaps turn his back on NATO altogether. I mean, surely the groveling option is the preferable of the two.
Is it really? Is it? Is this really the attitude, the level of ambition that Europeans and Canadians should show? I doubt that very strongly. I wish Europeans would develop a stronger sense of self-confidence and political stamina. I wish very much they would be obviously open and ready to continue working with the United States. I've been a transatlantist for really all my life, so I really wish that we would have a United States on our side on which we can rely on. But I very much doubt that this is the case. So in order to really move forward with the pressing issues here on our continent in Europe, and in order to really support Ukraine, which after 3 years and 4 months still endures, this absolutely reckless Russian aggression. I really want more, than European leaders groveling and hoping, that at some point President Trump will leave the NATO Council room happy. And I don't think this should be really our level of ambition.
So when you hear the Lithuanian president saying that we should choose a motto, which is to make NATO great again, what goes through your mind?
Yeah, strategic messaging is one. And as we already discussed, it would be really important for the allies, the 32 allies, to come across as dedicated, resolved, and really with, a shared vision of how they want to go about reinvigorate European security. But we don't do this. We talk a lot. We invent new terms like make NATO great again. But at the end of the day, what counts is the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground, that's why I feel so passionate about Ukraine, is that we have failed. We continue to fail to push back a Russian aggressor, which is so reckless and which is killing and terrorizing Ukrainian people all the way in the run-up to this wonderful historic, summit. We really, I think, must become better. And so I really hope for those in the alliance, for those very clear-eyed governments, in particular in Scandinavia, in the Nordic region, in Poland, in the Baltic countries, who understand what is at stake and are really prepared to take the necessary steps.
I mean, under the previous leadership of the alliance, with President Biden at the White House, this war with Ukraine started. Obviously, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and they didn't manage to stop it. And here we are in the fourth year of this war, as we've been saying in this conversation, and the war still hasn't stopped. Are you at all confident that some fresh approaches, like the ones that President Trump has discussed, and with some unorthodox methods, which we've seen from President Trump, are you at all confident that that could somehow or other yield a result?
No, I'm not. My assumption is that the Russian side will continue executing their summer campaign, all the way in the next few weeks and months, probably by the end of autumn, early winter, once they come to a halt. They will signal more readiness to start negotiating in one way or the other. And I continue to believe that President Putin feels simply emboldened by our policy. We keep on saying we support Ukraine as long as it takes. We haven't identified any form, any type of strategic end state. If you don't have an end state, if you are, unclear about what is it that you want to achieve, do we want to have a frozen war in the middle of Europe? Is this really what we want collectively? And give in to the Russian president? Or do we want to help Ukraine defeat Russia? Unless this question is not answered, we keep on circulating around. And I can only praise the Ukrainian political stamina and resolve, because they continue to make remarkable progress in terms of fighting back, developing their own defense industries, their own capabilities, making really smart operational moves on the battlefield, like we've seen just a couple of weeks ago. And so I think Ukrainians they have already become the strategic center of gravity in Europe. So the question should no longer be whether, we support them and, let them wait in front of the NATO doors for the next, 20 years? But I think the question should be rather the other way around. What is it, that Ukrainians can provide and perhaps will be ready to provide in order to secure European security? And yes, that's a question I don't think that has ever occurred to President Trump, nor has he ever voiced it, nor I think is he, someone who thinks in terms of strategic categories. He thinks in terms of quick deals, deliverables, and messages he can sell towards his home base back in the United States.
And just lastly, Dr. Babst, and briefly, if you will, and I'm sure you'll be glad to be brief on this last answer, because I don't think you're going to like the question, but the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, likened President Trump to a daddy. That was one of the headlines that came out of the NATO summit, that President Trump is a daddy. Is that an image he conjures up for you?
The organization that I worked for the past 23 years is not a cartel led by, a chief whose ring you need to kiss. I think that says it all.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Stefanie Babst, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much for this very good conversation. I appreciate that. All the best to you.
Thank you.